Hi, everybody. My name's Adam Carpenter. As you just heard Adi talk about, there's a lot of ways developers are considering diversifying their revenue, be it ads, IAP, subscriptions. For those of you who are already firmly invested in the IAP space, I'm going to try to go a little bit deeper and talk about some of the signs and the patterns that you can see in your own data, which can potentially help you identify if there's opportunities to grow your business. So one of the ways I always like to look and think about the whole notion of revenue and how it all interrelates is something that we call the revenue tree, or some people call the revenue funnel. And this is kind of a very important view because it shows how all the core components fit together and feed upwards to generate the revenue that we see on a daily basis. And if you're not familiar with this graph, to get the top level metric, you'd multiply the two below it, except in the case of the dotted line boxes, where you'd add them together. And now when I think about a lot of the core monetization metrics, generally speaking, I like to divide them into two different categories. The first, the daily buyer percentage, I always like to think of that as the primary monetization metric, since if you're thinking about the effectiveness and your ability to monetize your users, it's almost always better to go for breadth. It's significantly safer to try and get a buck out of everybody versus being overly reliant on your whales. In contrast, I like to think of average revenue per paying user, average transaction value, and transactions per buyer as secondary monetization metrics. Because while they're critically important, what they really measure is your ability to extract value from users who have already chosen to pay. And one of the jokes I used to kind of make when I was on the developer side, and I still kind of make it at Google Play, give me virtually any game, tell me to double average revenue per paying user, I could easily do that and tank the business at the same time, because it's always so easy to squeeze players, and you're lifting up your average revenue per paying user, but your buyer conversion is plummeting. And so in terms of topics today, I'm going to kind of walk through the revenue tree. And the first thing I want to do is take a look at top-line revenue health and show you some of the ways that I like to monitor revenue performance that help me understand how a game is doing. And then next, we're going to take a look at buyer percentage, and in particular, talk about some ways to think about increasing your returning buyers, and especially the frequency at which users are paying within a month. And finally, we're going to move on to talking about the secondary metrics. And there, I'm going to primarily try to give you some food for thought about some ways that you can potentially change your games that could help improve the metrics in that space. So to kick off, with top-line revenue, one of the major ways that we're always driving it, one of the major ways that we're maximizing our performance, LiveOps. Most of you are already probably doing it. If not, you're probably considering it. And it's such an integral part of driving our businesses, of stimulating demand. But LiveOps isn't this one monolithic thing. And the way that I like to think of it is breaking it out into supply-side sales or demand-side events. And I like this notion because it helps to think about the balance between the two. So supply-side sales, that's the injection of discounted assets into the economy, the ways that you can give users additional value for each of the dollars that they're paying. And in contrast, demand-side events, this is when we're running the tournaments, the weekend challenges, the competitive engagements, all the ways that we get players to engage more significantly, ideally draining down their asset balance and creating the greater potential for those users to pay. And the interrelation between the two is critically important in order to ensure that you have a very balanced and healthy game economy and that your revenue is ultimately strong. Here's a couple examples of vastly different ways that developers like to run their LiveOps. In the case of the blue line, the one on the left, this is a perfect example of a developer who likes to run the occasional, roughly once per month, massive sale. And what you can see is they generate a significant amount of revenue during that period. But then on a normal week-by-week basis, you're seeing this is the start of a LiveOps, revenue spikes, trends down, that's the off day of the week when it's not running, and then it starts again. And so you kind of have this constant pattern on a week-by-week basis. The green one, this is an example of a developer who's trying to run LiveOps virtually every day. They're balancing their supply side and their demand side, and what they're doing is creating a much tighter band, and it's a very interesting perspective and an interesting approach. Because what the developer's fundamentally trying to ensure is that every day is appealing. Every single day, some of their users are perceiving good value in the game and being willing to opening up their wallets and paying. And so a great way to kind of think about this is, what's the right strategy? What's the best strategy? Unfortunately, I can't really tell you that one is inherently better than the other. It depends on your development team, what your skill sets are, what your game is. But one of the strategies that you can use to understand how your LiveOps is performing is a monitoring technique we call the revenue heartbeat. And what the revenue heartbeat does, in any given calendar month, calculate the minimum revenue day, the maximum revenue day, and the average revenue for the month. And then if you plot it over time, you get a visualization like what you see here. And ideally with the revenue heartbeat, what we're really trying to see is that the min and the max, they form a tight band around the average. That you don't see any wild variations on a month-by-month basis, you don't see any divergence. And that as your average revenue is growing, you're seeing that the bands themselves, they're not inherently widening. Because this ensures that you're stimulating the right kind of demand on a day-by-day basis, and that your players are engaging heavily and engaging consistently. Some of the more negative patterns that you would see, these are shown here. And I really like point A as an example, because this is a wonderful case of a game which in the month of March, they actually ran a massive sale, but what that sale resulted in was a pretty significant hangover. And so you can see the spike, but then the min fell off, and it actually resulted in a drop in the average. So while sales are inherently good, if you can't minimize the amount of hangover, the duration of it, you can run into results like this, where your revenue ends up being net negative for the month when you compare to the month before. In contrast to that, point B in June, this is actually a great example of a developer who began tightening up their economy during that particular month. They didn't run as many sales, but they were stimulating the demand. And what that was very effective at doing was getting users to drain their asset balance down, so there was more of the need to pay. Because as we all know, for IAP games, if a user's asset balance is high, what's the point of spending any money? But then you always run into situations like you see with point C here. Massive Black Friday sale, not enough demand afterwards, so you see a big spike, but the min fell off again. So this revenue heartbeat, it's a really wonderful way that you can actually monitor and understand the performance of your game and get a good sense of the effectiveness of the sales that you're running and whether you're running potentially too frequently. There's also some more advanced ways that you can take a look at your revenue. And one of the ones that I particularly like is calculating the coefficient of variation for your daily revenue across a month. For those of you who aren't familiar with this calculation, what it is take all the daily revenue within a month, calculate the standard deviation of it, and divide it by the mean. What that will give you is a measure of the variability or volatility of your revenue in the month. You can effectively think of it as a percentage score. And so it's really useful for quantifying LiveOps performance. And additionally, what we've actually found is that correlation or coefficient of variation, it actually correlates to revenue growth. And so what I'm going to talk you through now is how you can actually use this to understand the potential for your games to grow month over month and the kind of optimizations and the values that you should be looking for. This particular graph, and I'll explain it, this is looking at the top 250 IAP games between January 2017 and January 2018. And what we've done is looked at their coefficient of variation by month, and we've put them all into buckets. And so what you can largely see is that a majority of the games had a coefficient of variation below 39%. So there was some volatility, but there wasn't an extreme amount. Where it gets really interesting is we take coefficient of variation and we look at which of these games had month-over-month growth. That's what we see here. The games with the lowest coefficient of variations were much more likely to see month-over-month growth. Games with a coefficient of variation between 10% and 19% saw month-over-month growth about 56% of the time. In contrast, games with a very high volatility, they saw month-over-month growth less than half of the time. So it's kind of an important thing to consider. How volatile is the revenue in your game? How volatile are the sales? And is it actually going to be healthy for you? And is there an opportunity to try and optimize your LiveOps cadence, balance the demand and supply side events, and decrease that volatility? Because at the end of the day, volatility is not the ideal scenario that we're looking for. Consider a game where you're running regular weekly sales and events, or you're running major tentpole of sales at the beginning of the month. How easy is it for your users to figure out what their pattern is, and I'd figure out that, well, they always run a major sale at the beginning of the month. Why should I ever spend money any other time? And as soon as you start to create that habit, the expectation, the anticipation of your users about when the sales and the events are going to occur, this is when you can start getting into asset hoarding situations. Because users know when the sale is, they spend as much money as they possibly can afford during that sale, and then they ride those discounted assets for as long as possible. This results in things like spend cannibalization, because users aren't going to spend right before the sale because they know it's coming. And all of these combined, this is what gives us the revenue hangovers that once players have figured out the pattern, you're actually losing money when you think about when you run your sale and the hangover you receive afterwards. So one of the ideas we always like to talk about, and I really encourage you guys to think about this, it's what I call predictable unpredictability. And what I mean by that is, can you create scenarios and situations in your game where users log in expecting something good to happen, but they have no idea what that good thing is? Can you get your users to anticipate a good thing, but they're not going to fundamentally change your behavior before it actually occurs? It's a pattern I used to use very effectively on the developer side, and I'd encourage you to think about how predictable is your game in terms of the events, and is there an opportunity to spice that up, make it so that players are not fundamentally changing their behavior because they know what you're doing. So moving on from that, I want to talk a little bit about increasing your returning buyers. And I want to talk a lot about the 80-20 rule. How many of you guys are familiar with this in games? Okay, a few of you. What the rule, it's almost like an industry meme, says is, in a calendar month, the top 20% of payers contribute 80% of the revenue. And when we look at the Google Play data, it's actually largely true when you look across the entire ecosystem. Top 20% of payers pretty much contribute about 80% of the revenue when you look across each and every game. But I've always kind of thought, like, it doesn't seem inherently healthy. It doesn't seem like it's long-term sustainable. And it probably doesn't seem like what the best performing games out there are doing. And in fact, they're actually not. This is the top 25 games on Google Play during the month of April. And what we can actually see, only 6 of these guys got more than 80% of their revenue from the top 20% of payers. Majority of them, they were in the low 70s. 3 of them were in the 60s. 2 of the games in the top 25, they were actually in the 50s. So that the top 20% of their payers only contributed about 53, 55% of their revenue. These top games are getting money from a much more diverse range of players. And I really want to kind of drive that home. Because what we're looking at here, this is the top 100 games in the month of April. And what you can actually see, as it rises, the further down the top charts you go, the more reliant these games are on their top 20% of payers. It's kind of important to think about. And think about, where does your game fall into the top charts? And how reliant are you on your top payers? And is there an opportunity to actually broaden your base? Because I really think this is a key concept, that the leading games on Play, they've got the most distributed revenue. And so how can you take that as inspiration and figure out opportunities for improving and optimizing your games? One of the ways I actually like to look at it is taking monthly ARPU, average revenue per paying user, and the number of unique days users are paying in a month. And what I like to do is slice it into deciles. And for anybody who's not familiar what a decile is, effectively we take all the payers in a month, we put them into 10 buckets. People who paid the most go in the first bucket, people who paid the second most go in the second bucket, and so on. And what I'm going to talk through in these slides, this is an example of a fairly typical action RPG. And what you can see is The top decile, the people who paid the most, $579 on average in a month. It's a pretty good amount. The second best decile, $120 a month. And so this is kind of falling into that 80-20 rule, this example game. Most of their revenue is coming from the highest paying users. But what about all of these guys? 50% of the monthly buyers in this example game, and this isn't a contrived example, this is a real example, paid less than $10. Is that an opportunity for growth, or is that just something we don't care about because we only care about the highest value users? To me, because I'm like the ultimate growth mindset person, I think it's a real opportunity. And in particular, if we actually take a look at the number of unique days all of these monthly buyers paid, half of them only paid on one single day. How easy would it be to get these guys and gals to pay just one extra day out of the month? It doesn't seem like it'd be that hard to me to provide them with the right compelling value proposition, which incentivizes them to open up their wallets a second day. And actually what we've seen when we look across virtually every game, and I'd really encourage you guys to check this yourselves, for most of the IAP games, somewhere between 40 and 60% of your monthly buyers are only going to pay on one day. And so what's kind of the real opportunity here? What should we be focusing on, and where can we extract potentially the most value? In my mind, it's taking a really focus on those users who are only paying on one day. And again, with this example game, what we see is 80% of these buyers who only paid on one day, they paid less than $10. So this, to me, is just this huge upside and this huge opportunity to go after these users with very targeted offers, very targeted sales, an exceptional, compelling value proposition, and get them to open up their wallets. Because if your game had 50% of the buyers who only paid on one day, and 80% of them paid less than $10, think about if you can convert half of them to paying another $5, another $2, another $10. That seems like a huge upside to me. And it's one of the great things because it's really, really sustainable. And so what I really encourage you to do in terms of improving performance is think about that value proposition. Think about how you're communicating the value for money to your users. How compelling is it? How easy is it for your users to understand what they're actually getting? I'd also encourage you to think about your sales segmentation, and especially how you're presenting it to users. One of the things I've often seen in games, and I've often wondered about this from a user psychology perspective, if I'm a low-value user who occasionally spends $5 and a game runs a major sale, and I see a $100 SKU in the game, am I going to be excited about the $5 offer you're giving me, or am I going to be upset seeing the major value proposition given to high spenders, and I'm not even going to spend my $5 because I know that my $5 won't let me compete with the guys who are spending $100. So think about how you're segmenting your users and how you're presenting those offers, and try to give users offers that are targeted to their personal spending habits and strongly appeal to them. Another one that I want to think of, or get you to think about, is daily deals. And these are becoming a lot more popular, but if you think about some of the top games that are doing them, are they really communicating value well? Are they communicating the concept of scarcity well? And are they really communicating almost like aspirational goals for making that purchase? Because I think that the notion of daily deals is extremely effective, but I'd encourage you guys to try and up-level it. And the last one I'd encourage you to think about is this notion of like a repeat buyer's bonus. What can you effectively create which motivates users to spend every single week? And I'll throw out one that I've been rolling around. What if your game, let's say you have a game that has XP in it. What if you created, let's say, a 10% XP bonus for anyone who purchases during the week? So if you purchase any amount of money, $1 even, you get a 10% bonus for the next 7 days. Is that really going to hurt your game economy, or is that going to create a compelling reason for users to purchase at any price point every single week? I think it's the latter, because I think that's an extremely appealing benefit that users would get, plus, of course, the IAP that they'd be purchasing. And now the last thing I want to talk about is optimizing secondary metrics. And here, I'm not going to have any strong advice. This is more of a food for thought thing. Because I do think there's some opportunities for us to improve our secondary metrics. And where I want to start off is kind of looking at core metrics for, like, kind of the percentiles for the secondary metrics across Google Play. And if we look at transactions per buyer, and this is across the top 250 IAP games, we see that on any given day, a user who purchases makes somewhere between 1.5 and 1.9 transactions. And they're doing so at a price point of $8.50 to $25. And ultimately, what this results in is an average revenue per paying user, depending on the game, of somewhere between $13.70 and $44.50. That's a pretty significant amount. But oftentimes, it's coming from a very small set of users. And so I think it's something important to consider is, what's the relationship between all of these metrics, and is there opportunities for improvement? When we take a look at how average transaction value on the x-axis compares to average revenue per paying user on the y-axis, it's positive, it's linear. If you can get users to purchase at a higher price point, you're going to get more revenue out of them. Obviously, that one. But I think the key thing here is that given that the transactions per buyer on a daily basis were only 1.5 to 1.9, the primary driver for average revenue per paying user, it's coming from that average transaction value. In contrast, when we plot transactions per buyer on the x-axis and average revenue per paying user on the y-axis, it's kind of just noise. We actually spent a decent amount of time looking at cluster analysis, curve fitting, and other options like that. Could not figure out any reliable pattern to predict what was going on here. And so this is one of these areas where I think it's actually more tied to a game's design and a game's core economy. And one of the things I'm starting to think about is, how can we actually leverage game design to bring more order to the chaos that is this relationship? Game design has always been like one of my big things. And if you go way back, I was actually a systems designer for years. And game economy is one of my other loves. And it's always figuring out, how do you create the right appeal in your players? How do you incentivize the right kind of sync rates? And what are the improvement things that we can do? Because if you think about that transactions per buyer, and I encourage you to think about this from the perspective of your own game. Where do you fall in this spectrum? Are you below the 25th percentile? And if you are below the 25th percentile, how many assets are you selling in your game? Do you only sell gems, or only sell coins, or only sell credits? And if you do, what kind of price points are you actually selling it at? Because what I want you to consider is that if you have a low number of transactions per buyer, and you're seeing a lot of them being sold at very high price points, what's going to be that velocity per money? Or have you effectively created a scenario where users are incentivized to buy the largest pack possible because of the bonuses that are on top of them, and then they ride those assets for as long as possible? Because users know that they're going to spend them eventually, so there's no urgency to buy on multiple times. In contrast, if you're above the 75th percentile, I think the first question to ask is, how many assets are you selling? If you're selling 2 or more, I think it's perfectly fine. I think you're in a really healthy range. If you're only selling one kind of asset, what impulse buying decision-making are you actually creating in your game? Have you created a scenario where users are incentivized to make a small number, or a large number of very small transactions each day? $2, $2, $2. If you are, I think there's a risk that you're leaving some money on the table. Because every time a user has to make a decision about making a purchase, there's a chance that they'll stop. And so if you do have a case where a large number of transactions are at very small price points, think about whether there's an opportunity to upsell your users. Instead of showing them $2 for X number of gems, give them a $2 offer and give them a $5 offer. Present them with 2 choices and see if you can upsell them. Because at the end of the day, I really do think that there's some opportunities to optimize and improve this area, but it's fundamentally going to come down to you guys, the developers, because each set of games is different. And so what I ask you to encourage you to do is go back to your development teams and ask questions like, what's your velocity of money? How many impulse purchases are players making on each and every day? Does your game incentivize asset hoarding? And in particular, how's your game economy designed? Is it a CapEx economy where users are primarily purchasing assets, purchasing, let's say, gems, and spending them to get permanent upgrades? Or is it more a case that users are purchasing some sort of a consumable asset, coins, credits, and they're spending them as part of their daily play? And now, this is kind of like one of my views in terms of growth, in terms of how we build our business, and talk through all three of these areas. So just in the last couple minutes, I want to give you what I see as the key takeaways I'm hoping you'll take with you. Minimize volatility, because that's going to be the biggest driver for revenue growth. Figure out how your LiveOps performing, how you're balancing your supply and demand side events, and see if you can actually close that volatility. Because what we've seen from the top games on play, the lower the monthly or daily volatility, the more likely games are to see month-over-month growth. I also want you to consider, what's the 80-20 rule look like in your game? How much revenue are the top 20% of your payers contributing? And is there an opportunity to diversify and broaden your base to get users who are only spending once per day or once per month to spend a second time per month? Because what we've seen from the top 25 games on play, they're significantly less reliant on their whales than other games that are further down the top charts. And finally, just think about your secondary metrics. Because we see that average transaction value and average revenue per paying user, there's a strong correlation. But there's not much of a correlation, no correlation at all, between transactions per buyer. I don't have a solution for this one, but I think with all the creative minds that are out in the audience and all of your creative teams, I think one of you guys, or many of you guys, can figure out a way to actually improve this and optimize it to better grow your business. So, hope you guys got some benefit out of this today. Really appreciate your time here.